Greetings everybody. Welcome to Nursery Production and Management. Today's video topic is growing media components. Let's talk a little bit about the word media. Media is the plural of the word medium. Within the context of this course, a medium is the same as a potting medium or a potting soil. But keep something else in mind. Most modern potting media do not actually contain any real soil at all. Is water the ideal medium? Well, we can certainly use water as a medium for rooting certain types of stem cuttings, but is it a good growing medium? What about sand? We also can use sand to root cuttings, but sand makes a poor growing medium because of its inability to retain water and/or nutrients. So neither water or sand by themselves make a good growing medium. Today's modern media are made from both organic and inorganic components that are blended together. Let's go ahead and talk about the four functions of a growing medium. So what is it exactly that a growing medium is supposed to do for a plant? So keep in mind also that this whole discussion that we're having now is about growing medium that you would use in a container. So we're talking about growing plants in containers, and of course we can do this within the context of a greenhouse, but we could also grow plants in containers outdoors in more of a nursery setting. So let's go ahead and discuss the four functions or jobs of a growing medium. Okay, number one, the growing medium has to provide a reservoir of nutrients. So what do we mean by this? A growing medium has to be able to retain nutrients. It has to have a certain amount of cation exchange capacity. The second function of a growing medium is to provide a source of water for the roots. So a growing medium has to have some water holding capacity because we know that plants require water for growth to maintain their metabolism. So we have to have some way of providing this water. The third function of a growing medium is to provide aeration and drainage. Aeration is important because the roots of plants respire. Air containing oxygen must be able to enter the pore spaces between the particles that make up the medium. The oxygen diffuses across the cell membranes of the root epidermis. Once inside the root, it is used in cellular respiration. And finally, the fourth job or function of a growing medium is to support the plant in a container. So we often use the word anchorage, and anchorage refers to the ability of the medium to support or hold up the plant that's growing in that particular container. We can take all the growing media that are out there and basically put them into two very broad categories. We can say that a certain media is soil-based, which means that it contains some real soil, or that it is soilless, which means it contains no real soil at all. Let's talk first about soil-based media. So these are different media, different recipes that actually contain soil. And there are some nursery and operations in the United States where some growers still choose to put soil into their growing medium. If you do that, then that particular medium may require something called disinfesting. So disinfesting, or probably the better way to say this is disinfestation, is the process of killing all the nasty plant pathogens like fungi, bacteria, and soil-borne nematodes that might happen to be in that soil when you blend it in with the other ingredients. On the other hand, soilless media contain no soil at all, and they generally do not require disinfestation. They are available to be purchased either in bags or in bulk, or some growers choose to mix or create their own soilless media right on site. Soilless media is the most common type of medium used by the nursery industry. All right, let's go ahead and look at some of the components or some of the ingredients that make up different soil and soilless growing media. So we'll go ahead and start with organic media components. So the first question we have to ask is, what exactly do we mean by the word organic? What does that word mean? Organic means derived from something that was at one time alive. And you can compare that with inorganic. Inorganic means not derived from a living source. So let's go ahead and look at some examples. And you can decide whether you think the following media ingredients or components are organic or inorganic. Peat. I think you're all familiar with peat. Peat is basically decomposed plant material, different reeds, sedges, and mosses that have died and decomposed. These are the ingredients that make up peat. So would peat be organic or inorganic? Well, the answer is peat is definitely organic because it came from plant material that was once alive, even though peat itself is decomposed plant material. Granite. Well, granite is a rock, and rocks are inorganic. Vermiculite. Vermiculite is a component that we see in many different types of growing media. Vermiculite is actually a mica-like mineral that's mined and then heated up in a furnace to a very high temperature. So vermiculite would be inorganic. Bone meal. Bone meal is something that you can buy at a garden center, and bone meal is a byproduct of animal slaughterhouse operations, so bone meal would be organic. Manure. Well, we know where that comes from, and that is definitely organic. Pine bark comes from pine trees. Pine trees were at one time alive before they were cut down and sawn into lumber. So pine bark is an organic component. Perlite is also found in many different growing media. Perlite is a type of volcanic rock that is crushed and like vermiculite, it is heated to high temperatures in a furnace. So perlite would be inorganic. Sand is of mineral origin. Sand is inorganic. And milorganite, you may never have heard about this, but milorganite is a brand of biosolids fertilizer that's produced by treating sewage sludge. So milorganite would be organic. All right, so hopefully going through those will give you a better feel for what types of media components are organic or inorganic in nature. All right, we are going to go through different media components now. And as mentioned earlier, we'll start with the organic components first. Each slide is set up in the following way. So there are three primary things that we're going to look at. In the first column, we'll talk about the origin or where this particular component comes from. In the second column, we'll indicate whether the component is organic or inorganic in nature. And in the third column, probably the most important column, we'll talk about the role or job that that particular component has in the overall growing medium. Additionally, we may talk about some potential problems associated with using that growing medium component. So let's go ahead and begin with peat moss. So sphagnum moss is a plant that grows in bogs that are found primarily in Canada and across the northern United States. When sphagnum moss plants die, they begin to decompose and they form peat. And this peat is organic in nature. And when we use sphagnum peat in growing medium, we put it in a growing medium primarily because of its high water holding capacity. So sphagnum peat can hold several times its weight in water. So that's the main reason we use it in a growing medium. Sphagnum peat is also acidic by nature, which means that it kind of helps reduce or bring down the pH of a growing medium. And in many cases, that's advantageous. That's a good thing to do. And sphagnum peat is lightweight. A potential problem is that sphagnum peat is hydrophobic, which means that it is water-fearing, at least when it's dry. Versus something that is hydrophilic, which means water loving. So what happens is when sphagnum peat dries out, it can be difficult to re-wet it, and that can be a problem. So most commercial manufacturers of growing medium, if they're using sphagnum peat, they are going to add something called a wetting agent to the medium, which is put in to help the sphagnum peat re-wet more easily. Okay, this is a nice shot of some sphagnum peat moss. Kind of a nice dark, rich brown color there. When you get to the full PowerPoint version, there's a video on harvesting peat moss in Canada, which is interesting, so you can enjoy that. All right, the next organic media component that we want to discuss is something called coir. Even though it's spelled C-O-I-R, it's pronounced coir, and it comes from coconut husks. It is organic, and its role in the medium is water holding capacity. So it's used in a similar fashion to sphagnum peat moss in medium, It is more resistant to breakdown than sphagnum peat moss, and it is easier to re-wet than sphagnum peat moss. So where exactly from the coconut does coir come from? Well, if you think of a coconut is a seed, and after the white-colored coconut flesh has been removed, what remains is the outer husk. And the outer husk is really composed of two things. It's made up of fibers and core. Now the fibers can be used to make many useful products. Have you ever seen a doormat made from coconut fibers? So that's what the fibers are used for. And then the core is kind of what's left. So the core is kind of embedded around in between the coconut fibers. And after those fibers have been extracted, then you have the core. Okay, core has one potential problem, and that is it can be high in soluble salts. So they recommend that before you use it in a growing media, that you go ahead and leach it with water to try to get rid of some of those salts that may be in the core. All right, so here's a picture of core, and as you can see from the picture, it looks a lot like sphagnum peat moss. And as we've just seen, it has a very, very similar role to sphagnum peat moss in a growing medium. Okay, here are some examples of compressed core bricks. So if you wanted to use one of these bricks, you'd have to break these up and fluff them up and add a little bit of water, and then go ahead and mix the core with your other ingredients to produce your growing medium. Okay, this is a little video or a link to a website on coconut coir, so you can read more about what exactly coir is and where it comes from. Okay, another very, very popular organic media component is pine bark. So pine bark is a byproduct of the lumber industry, and it is now the primary component in most outdoor container nursery mixes. Before a pine log can be sawn into lumber, the log has to be run through a machine called a debarker, and the debarking machine will strip off all the bark. So the pine bark is then passed through another machine called a hammer mill, and the hammer mill will break the bark into smaller pieces. Ultimately, the pine bark is passed through a series of sieve-like screens to produce the final product. So pine bark is organic, and what role does it have in the medium? Well, it's screened to various sizes, so depending on whether you're growing plants outdoors in containers or in a greenhouse, you might buy different sized pine bark. Its main job in a growing medium is to provide aeration and drainage. It does hold some nutrients. It does resist decomposition, so we're talking about the pine bark nuggets themselves do resist decomposition. It has fewer leachable organic acids compared to hardwood bark, and it adds a certain amount of weight to the growing medium, which can help support the plants. Okay, a potential problem with pine bark is something called nitrogen draft, which can occur in the pot or container where the plant is growing, especially if you're using fresh pine bark. So it's probably always better to use composted pine bark. But when you're using fresh pine bark, there could be some loss of nitrogen from the growing medium. And this is because the microorganisms that might populate that growing medium after it's mixed and created, they're going to use that nitrogen as an energy source. So they're going to be grabbing that nitrogen, which means that if they're using it, then the roots of the plants growing in those containers can't use it. Nitrogen just won't be available. So the solution to this is when you're using fresh bark is to add 1 pound of nitrogen per cubic yard of growing medium. That will provide enough nitrogen for both the plant that's growing in the container and for any microorganisms that are trying to break down the container components. Okay, 2 pictures. Top picture showing pine bark fines and the bottom picture showing pine bark nuggets. Some videos for you to watch in the full version of the PowerPoint. Okay, this indicates the different pine bark products that are available for sale. So for example, if you were to buy what's called -1-inch pine bark, that means that the pine bark would have been passed through a 1-inch square screen. So what do you get? After you pass the pine bark through that size screen, you're going to get pine bark nuggets up to about 1 inch in diameter, and then you're going to get smaller nuggets and smaller particles right down to the bark fines. You can buy a product called -3/4-inch pine bark, which would have been passed through a 3/4-inch mesh screen, and you would get nuggets up to 3/4 of an inch in diameter, including smaller particles right down to and including the bark fines, and then really the same for the -1/2-inch product. So which product you use in part is going to be determined by the crop that you're growing and how long the crop is going to be in the container. If your crop is going to be in the container for a short period of time, for example, maybe a matter of months, then you would probably want to use something like the -1/2-inch pine bark. If your crop was maybe a tree that was growing in a large container, and it might be in that container for 1 to 2 years, then you might want to consider using a larger bark product like the -3/4 or -1-inch products. Hardwood bark is another organic media component. So this is different than pine bark because the hardwood bark is going to come from different genera of trees that would include oaks, maples, ash trees, etc. So we're not talking about pine bark, we're talking about the bark of trees that are known as hardwoods, and hardwood bark could contain the bark of several different tree genera, and we just went over what some of those genera are. Obviously, it's bark, so it is organic, and its role in the growing medium is to primarily improve aeration and drainage. It does provide some nutrient containment, which means that it does hold on to some nutrients. It is less resistant to decomposition than compared to pine bark. So in other words, pine bark is more resistant to decomposition, and it adds a certain amount of weight to the growing medium. A potential problem with hardwood bark is that it typically contains some toxic compounds that may inhibit plant growth, and in order to use it safely, it should be composted before use. So here's a picture of composted hardwood bark. Okay, parboiled rice hulls. These are produced by steaming and drying rice hulls after the milling process has occurred. The resulting product is free of weed seeds. Rice hulls are organic. They are lightweight, and their primary role in a container medium is to increase drainage and aeration. A potential problem with rice hulls is that they are high in an element called manganese, and to avoid problems with manganese toxicity, it's important to keep the medium pH above 5. All right, so you're looking at a picture of parboiled rice hulls. So those are the organic media components, and there are certainly many more components that I haven't covered. I just tried to cover some of the basic, most widely used components in the industry. We are going to switch gears now and talk about inorganic media components. So these are components that, as we said earlier, come from a non-living source. We'll begin by talking about perlite. So perlite is actually a volcanic rock that is crushed and heated to high temperatures in a furnace. It is inorganic, and its primary role in the medium is to provide aeration and drainage. It is available in different grades or different sizes. And one problem with perlite is that it doesn't really absorb or hold any water at all. So it's really strictly used to improve medium aeration and drainage. All right, so here's a picture of perlite. Now you probably have seen this before. Maybe you didn't realize you were even looking at it, but it's white and it comes in different grades. You can get a coarse grade, medium grade, and a fine grade of perlite. So it has no water holding capacity and it has no cation exchange capacity. Vermiculite is a mica-like mineral that's crushed and heated in a furnace to high temperatures. So in that regard, it's very similar to perlite. It is inorganic, and unlike perlite, vermiculite does have water holding capacity and cation exchange capacity. So it does hold nutrients. It's available in different grades, and the coarser grades are used in ornamental horticulture as a growing media component to improve aeration and drainage. Potential problem, vermiculite should not be pressed or compacted, especially when it's wet, as this will destroy its desirable physical properties. So in other words, if you crush it when it's wet, it stays crushed and it won't expand back to its original size. All right, so here's a close-up of vermiculite. So it has water holding capacity and it has nutrient holding capacity. Okay, sand. There are many different grades of sand. There's fine sands, there's coarse sands. In horticulture, for growing media components, we tend to use the coarse sands. Sand is inorganic, and really the only reason we would ever add sand to a growing medium is to basically just add some weight to the medium or add some ballast to the medium. And I'll show you a picture in just a second as to why this is important. Okay, there is a common misconception out there. A lot of people think that if they add sand to a container medium, the sand will improve drainage, and this is really not the case. If the primary ingredient is pine bark, adding sand will actually decrease pore space and reduce drainage, and I'll show you a graphic illustration of how that works in just a second. All right, so here's an illustration of a container. And so let me outline the container for you. So just in case you're wondering what you're looking at here. So I'm going to take my red pen here. So this is the container. Here's the top right here. And this is the sidewall and the other sidewall. And then the bottom of the container right here. So think of these as being pine bark nuggets, maybe. Pine bark is very popular. And then these smaller round-shaped particles down here, think of this as being sand. So what happens if you're using sand in a certain medium? Even though you may blend and mix all the components together, what's going to happen over time is that because the sand is made up of a smaller particle and it's heavy, it is going to settle down towards the bottom of the container. And when it does that, it can reduce the pore space over time. So sand isn't useful in providing aeration and drainage. In fact, the opposite is more likely to occur. Really about the only thing sand is good for is adding some weight to the container medium. But you always want to use a coarse sand. The coarser the sand, the better. Okay, this is a great picture showing us what's called container blowover in the nursery. So all these organic media components that we've gone over previously, like coir or sphagnum peat moss or rice hulls, they're all pretty lightweight materials, lightweight components. So when we mix them together, we end up with a pretty lightweight growing medium. And then the plants that we grow in these different media can grow quite tall, like you see these evergreens here are spire shaped and they're growing pretty tall. And you set these pots outside and all of a sudden you get a windy day and the wind can knock all those pots down. So this is a huge problem because now you got to come back and set all these pots upright. You have to reconnect the drip tubes. You may have lost any fertilizer that you spooned into the container. So it's a big problem. So it's important that you have some weight in your medium to kind of help hold the plants up and prevent container blowover in the nursery. Obviously, this is not as big a concern if you're growing plants inside a greenhouse because a greenhouse is a more protected environment. All right, so we'll end the video presentation today by talking a little bit about disinfesting container media. So let's again, just to remind ourselves what disinfesting or disinfestation means. We're talking about raising the temperature of the growing medium to a certain point or to such a point or temperature where harmful plant pathogens like fungi, bacteria, and soil-borne nematodes are going to be killed. Okay, so disinfestation is different than pasteurization. When you pasteurize something, you're raising it to a pretty high temperature and you're killing virtually everything. With disinfestation, you're raising it to a temperature between 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're trying to kill primarily the plant pathogens that could be destructive. So how can we accomplish this? How can we perform disinfestation? One method is to use aerated steam. So this would be steam disinfestation. And then another way to disinfest a growing medium is to use electricity. And I'll show you a device that does that in just a second. All right, so this is an interesting graph to look at because this shows us what temperatures are needed to kill certain kinds of pathogens or to destroy weed seeds in growing medium. So there's two sides to this. There's the Fahrenheit scale on the left, which we're going to be more familiar with, and then there's the Celsius scale on the right-hand side. So if you look at something like Pythium, Phytophthora, most nematodes, they're going to be killed somewhere around 100 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Most plant pathogenic fungi and bacteria, worms, slugs, and centipedes, they're going to be killed when you get the temperature up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the insects in the soil are going to be killed when you get the temperature up to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And then the weed seeds are more problematic. Most weed seeds are going to be killed at temperatures of around 170, 175 degrees Fahrenheit. But there are a few resistant weed seeds that are not going to be killed until you get the temperature up to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so we just mentioned that aerated steam was one method that you could use to disinfest a growing medium. And so this is an example of a machine that generates steam. It makes steam. This is an example of a aeration blower. So this is a machine that is going to take the steam created by the steam generator and move it through the hose that you see in the picture there. Okay, this is a cart for steam disinfestation. So if you look at this cart right here, you see that there's a hookup for a hose. So that's where your steam hose is going to get attached. And then there's going to be a series of baffles or pores that the steam can, move through to get into the medium that you put inside of this cart. And then there's a tarp that fits over the top so you don't lose that steam. Okay, and this particular cart has a 2 cubic yard capacity. You could probably get bigger ones, I'm sure. Okay, this is an example of a device that uses electricity to disinfest a container medium. So this is small. It only holds 1 cubic foot of medium. And basically it's got a cord that you plug in, then there's a heating element inside this box. You add your growing medium, put the lid on it, and let it cook. All right, so what are the temperature and time parameters for steam disinfestation? So in order for steam disinfestation to be effective, we need to get the temperature of the medium somewhere between 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. and we have to keep the temperature there for a minimum of 30 minutes after all the medium has reached somewhere between 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so keep in mind that steam disinfestation is something that may be required if you're using soil. If you're not using any soil in your medium, then you probably don't have to disinfest your medium. Also keep in mind that, we talked about various organic and inorganic medium components, and there are different recipes that use these different ingredients. So, no single recipe is going to use all the ingredients that we went over, but different recipes will use some ingredients and other recipes might use other ingredients. So growers kind of pick and choose what ingredients they want, but they are definitely going to have something in the container medium that's going to hold water and hold nutrients. They're going to want to have something that creates some aeration and drainage. They may want to have something in their medium that provides some weight or ballast to help hold plants up, especially if those plants are in an outdoor nursery setting. All right, so that's all I've got for you in this video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.